Thank you for tuning into my talk today on the known diets and habitats of global flower visiting fly species. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect. Hello, everyone.
Sorry.
Increasing reports of wild pollinator declines has the potential to impair global crop yields. Therefore, it is essential that we assess the abilities of other insect taxa capable of providing alternative or supplementary pollination services. You may not realize it, but there are a lot of flies that visit flowers. And in Australia alone, there's estimated to be about 30,000 different species of flies. These insects are critical to the ecosystem because they provide services, including decomposition, predation, and of course, pollination. Flower visiting flies, however, are understudied as they have been historically overlooked compared to bee pollinators. We still have much to learn about these flies, but before we can make decisions on which flies can be managed for pollination services, we need to go back to the basics and fill in some knowledge gaps about our general understanding of these flies. Flies are the second most important pollinator taxon behind bees, but how much do we really know about them? First, let's talk about what we know and love about bees. We consider social bees the ideal pollinators because they are easily managed in hives and can be transported to effectively pollinate crops. But our overdependence on social bees has led scientists to study solitary bees. And although there are thousands of solitary bees, we at least have a general idea of their habitat and diet preferences. And some of these bees we've actually already started commercializing. But flies live very different lives than bees. For pollination ecologists, we're most interested in the adult stage of the fly since it visits flowers, but the diets and habitats of fly larvae are equally as important to know. Adult bees provision their larvae or brood with similar diets, but fly larvae are left to fend for themselves. We seem to think of the larval and adult stages of flies as separate entities, and because of this, we have a hard time realizing that the one species can feed on very different things. Therefore, we decided to conduct a systematic literature review to identify the known diets and habitats of flower visiting fly species. We can infer ecological feeding guilds from these diets, and therefore we hypothesize that flies that provide services in both of their life stages are beneficial to the ecosystem. To conduct this literature review, we utilized a database consisting of 316 papers in the lab, and we took the flies identified to species visiting crop flowers from these papers to start the review. This ended up being about 300 species. But fly nomenclature is tricky, and it's actually often misspelled in literature, the names of these flies. And so after removing duplicates, we actually ended up with 276 different fly species. Using the genus species naming convention of the fly, we inputted each one through Scopus. And in doing this, we found 130 species with larval diet and habitat information and 146 species with no search results or no relevant information. We then took these 146 species, repeated our methodology, but screened them in Web of Science. And in doing this, we were able to add an additional 44 species. We also took the expert opinion of 10 different species. So in total, our database encompasses 184 different species with accessible diet and habitat information from 783 different records. But unfortunately, we were unable to find information for 92 of these species. After completing our literature review, we found that the larvae of the 184 species with accessible diet information fed on 33 natural or non-synthetic diets. The two most common ones were aphids and animal protein, but these larvae also fed on 25 different semi-synthetic and synthetic diets. The semi-synthetic diets that were most popular were typically vegetable powders and dried animal proteins, while the two synthetic diets were casein and carotene, which are animal products. And for the adults, for all 276 species, they all feed on nectar and or pollen. In total, we found they feed on the nectar and pollen of 64 different global crop systems. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in this talk, but if you do have any questions, feel free to send me an email after this. But we also found that the adults could also feed on other natural or non-synthetic diets. Interestingly, we found that quite a few different fly families feed on animal protein, but it's only the females that do this, and this is because they need the animal protein to start their reproductive cycle and actually produce eggs. Flower visiting flies use a diverse amount of habitats as larvae. We found 27 different habitats were utilized for the 184 different species with accessible habitat information. The habitat that we found the greatest records for was actually in the laboratory. We found 76 different species and 14 families were reared on both natural and synthetic substrates in the laboratory. But in natural conditions, the most amount of records came from host plants, followed by carrion, decaying plant materials, and manure and feces. As you can see, flies are very flexible animals, and the fact that there are 27 different habitats that only 184 different flies utilize means that we have a greater chance of supporting their habitats and thus their entire life cycle in fields. We took the diet information for both the larvae and adults, and we inferred the feeding guilds that these flies could fall under. And in doing this, we were able to create a network of what the larval feeding guilds are compared to the adult feeding guilds. The larval feeding guilds are at the top, and just for reference, the unknown category is the largest section with 92 species. The width of the figure is the number of species in the figure, which is 276. And all of the feeding guilds of the larvae do connect to the nectarivorous feeding guild at the bottom of the adult, but they also could connect to one of 6 other feeding guilds that the adults fell under. But the most important thing I'd like to highlight is that the larval feeding guilds of flies are extremely diverse. We found they could fall under one of 10 different categories, or multiple categories, truthfully. But the 2 most important ones with the most amount of species data we found for the larvae was the predators and detritivores. And they had roughly 40 to 50 species per each category. But the most interesting thing I found is that of the 184 species with known information, 180 of these species differ in feeding guilds as larvae compared to adults. But there's always the exception in the insect world. There are 4 species that did share feeding guilds. Only one, Toxomerus floralis, which is a syrphid fly, fed on pollen and nectar as a larvae and pollen and nectar as an adult. The rest spanned a few other feeding guilds, but still technically shared feeding guilds with their larval and adult stages. Continuing the feeding guild results, here we have the total number of feeding guilds in the life cycle of the 184 different fly species that we found information for. These flies could range between 1 and 6 different feeding guilds in their entire life cycle, and the species could fall under one of 23 different fly families. We saw a particular bias to the syrphid flies, the musket flies, and the caliphorid flies, and we assume that these flies are they're usually the most noticeable in the field. So when people are doing transect surveys, they see them, they feel confident enough to ID them, or like observationally ID them. And so they're recorded the most often. In reality, we expect there to be way more different fly families visiting flowers, but in the literature so far, these 23 different families have been recorded. And as you can see, 2 total feeding guilds dominates the other feeding guilds for the total number of guilds used in a life cycle for these flies. An example of this may be a fly feeding on aphids as a larvae, and then when it becomes an adult, it switches gears and feeds on nectar and pollen. While we were able to find diet records for 184 of the 276 flower visiting fly species, we did something a little unique in our literature review and actually rated the quality of the evidence that we found. The 783 total supporting records of the 10 different larval feeding guilds could fall under one of 4 categories, the 2 most prominent being inferred evidence and validated evidence. And we found that despite the large number of records on these flies, the diet information for only 41 species were entirely validated. And in contrast, the diet information for 56 of the 184 species are entirely inferred. So let's go back to the 2 starred feeding guilds I have on this figure, the detritivores and the predators. These were the feeding guilds in the network slide that had the greatest number of species in each. But as you can see, for the detritivores, the majority of the information is actually inferred. And luckily for the predators, the majority of the information is validated, but still we were not able to find any feeding guilds with entirely validated evidence. In conclusion, flower visiting flies use a diverse amount of habitats and diet substrates to complete their life cycle, and this gives us a greater chance of supporting their habitats in the wild. Many of these fly larvae live in their food, and flies typically feed on entirely different substrates in their 2 active life stages. So if there is one thing that you can take away from this talk, I really hope it is that to encourage beneficial fly species to visit flowers, we need to accommodate the needs of both life stages of the fly. Let's completely destroy the stigma that the larval stage and the adult stage of the fly are 2 separate entities, and let's start studying the both of them together. Thank you.